Alright, you little sweat stains. Today I'm gonna teach you how to mod like the pros. I've actually been into bullet editing since Dark Souls 3, downloading cheat tables and turning my little fireball spell into a howitzer missile. But as is the case with most hobbies of mine, I convinced myself I was terrible at it because I had low self-esteem, so I just didn't tell anyone. Now it's been 7 years and I feel like I'm the only person that actually enjoys that part of the work. And that makes me feel really weird, so I'm gonna teach some of you fuckers how it works too. Let's start with most of the stuff you probably already know, even if you're relatively new to modding. I'm assuming you already have a means to download, open, and play Elden Ring mods at your leisure, so I'm going into this thinking you already know what Nexus is, how to use ModEngine, all that boring shit, and I'm just gonna skip right over it. Open up the game and then open Yapt, Map Studio, a cheat table from some rando server, who cares, whatever you feel comfortable with. I just recommend Map Studio because that's the best software that's worked for me, but Yapt is a lot simpler in function, and if you're only interested in bullet editing, then it'll work just fine. Alright, let's get down to brass tacks, the goddamn basics. You probably suck at this, I'm just being honest. I know that because I've been doing this casually for 7 years and I still don't know what all this shit does. If you're like me, you opened Map Studio for the first time and your brain just went, I don't give a shit, I'm dumping all of this, I'm never modding again. Well, now it's time to confront that impulse. Open up the project of your choice or just create a new one, who cares. Head over to Param Studio and click on the word that says bullet. We're just gonna keep things simple for now, so type in Flamesling in the search box at the top and there should be 2 bullets each for the uncharged and charged variant. The first bullet is the projectile, the second is the damage radius. Simple enough? Each bullet has a projectile ID and an impact ID listed here. 524002 is the fireball, and 524003 is the little blast of fire that signals that you've hit something. All 6-digit spell IDs are in the 520-ish range, so you can change the impact ID to this number if you want a bigger boom, or this number if you want something that just doesn't make any fucking sense. Or you can just find an Excel sheet somewhere that has all the IDs listed and just use that to mess around with whatever you feel like. The duration is how long the bullet stays active. Flamesling has a default of 1.5, so you can change it to 0.15 if you want to turn it into a melee spell, or maybe 10 or something if you just want to practice your shot put technique by throwing it off cliffs at people. I usually just leave the distance at a flat 0 and let the final distance be controlled by the velocity of the bullet. Initial velocity is how fast the bullet starts out, max and min velocity should be self-explanatory, and the 2 acceleration variables here control the acceleration of the bullet. If you want a constant speed, just leave these alone. Here's what it looks like if you just have a constant speed of 10. Yep, it's kind of boring. But now here's what it looks like if you start off at 10 with acceleration values that are also set to 10. And now let's just set a maximum velocity at, let's say 35 or something. And there you go. You've just made your 537th glintstone pebble sorcery. Cool, upload it to Nexus, it's ready. The 2 gravity variables here control the effect of gravity on the bullet. If you want something to travel in an arc, set the shoot angle to a value between 0 and 90. I usually just do 30 because that's what feels comfortable on most bullets. And if you want to make it look natural, set the gravity out of range to be twice or around twice the in-range value. Flamesling, for example, has a gravity in range of 6 and a gravity out of range of 10. You'll see this a lot on pretty much any spell or bullet that travels in an arc. And now for the explosion radius. This will be controlled mainly by these 4 variables here. The initial explosion radius is how big the explosion starts out. Most flame and lightning spells have a radius of around 1.5 to 4, depending on how big and bad the spell is, but some climb even higher than that. Setting a final radius is useful for controlling a gradual explosion, and the spread time, of course, is the amount of time it takes for the bullet to reach its final radius. Most spread times are extremely quick, which makes them pretty much unnoticeable during regular gameplay, but I'm just gonna go ahead and set it to 1 full second here, with the initial at 0.1 and the final at 4. In this clip, I'm using honed bolts, and you'll be able to see a slight delay in the enemy I'm aiming at take damage, and the surrounding enemies taking damage because of the time it takes for the blast radius to fully expand. Oh, and just a rule of thumb, if any bullet touches the ground with the penetrate map option on, it'll terminate immediately. So if you're trying to create big-ass explosions that never seem to hit anything consistently, it's probably because you have this off on that specific bullet. Don't have this off. The explosion delay is exactly what it sounds like. It's the amount of time between when a bullet hits something and when it explodes. Here's a preview of a spell I made for 101 sorceries that can be likened to the Profane Flame from DS3 if you ever liked that garbage. This is a good use of the explosion delay, but there are plenty of others. Now the hit bullet ID is where the fun shit happens. Understanding the value of this parameter is what can really make some spells just fucking pop. In order to understand exactly how this works and why this parameter is so important, let's take a look at a more complicated spell like Beast Claw. The uncharged variant has 7 different bullets, while the charged variant has a total of 13. The hit bullet ID is basically the very next bullet that's set to play in a sequence after a bullet expires. If we look at how Beast Claw uses hit bullet IDs, we can see that the very first bullet fires an outward fan consisting of 5 bullets. Each bullet is aimed at a downward angle, controlled by this parameter here, and once it hits the ground, it then launches another bullet that does the exact same thing. This repeats 6 times for each of the 5 bullets, resulting in this wide fanning cone shape made by the spell. Each bullet has a really high gravity variable to make sure the next bullet in the sequence always goes straight into the ground and nowhere else, and each one has an impact FX ID of 530172, which is this vertical slashing effect that moves slightly forward. Gurank's Beast Claw goes by the same principles, only instead of fanning outwards in a cone shape, it travels completely around the caster. If you want to fire multiple bullets in a pattern or as an AoE around the caster, these parameters are where you're going to set that up. There's a little math involved in this, but if you're afraid of numbers, then just use a calculator or something. I don't expect you to have fucking multiplication tables hanging up in your room somewhere, except for that one guy that's about to type a comment about why it's not weird if you have multiplication tables hanging up in your room somewhere. The bullet count parameter is obvious enough, but the ones below it are where it gets a little more complicated. Homing angle is what you see on most of the Glintstone and Glintblade spells. This controls how many corrections per second the bullet has, which allows the bullet to precisely seek out the target you're locked onto. Basically, the higher this number is, the more likely it is to hit a locked-on enemy, no matter how frantically they move. Honed Bolt, for instance, has a really high homing angle in addition to a really high velocity, which is why it hits its target almost every time, even if they're in the middle of a dodge. Launch angle and launch angle interval is where the arithmetic comes in. You will only need this if you're launching multiple projectiles with a single bullet. Beast Claw is a good starting example of this, where the angle is set to -16, which means wherever you're aiming, it will launch 16 degrees to the left. Negative is left, positive is right, basically. The interval is set to a +8, which means every 8 degrees to the right, another of the 5 bullets will be launched. The reason this is so important is because this is why Beast Claw has the fan shape that it does. And if you're looking for a specific pattern, both the angle and the angle interval is going to depend on how many bullets you're launching in the first place. If you're launching 5, make the angle a negative number and have the interval be the angle divided by -2. In this case, -16 divided by -2 is 8, allowing the bullets to travel in this fanning shape. If you're launching 7, divide it by -3. If you're launching 9, divide it by -4, and so on and so forth. Gurank's Beast Claw is a little different because despite not having an angle, it launches 10 bullets at the same time, but set to an angle interval of 36. If you want a group of bullets to completely encircle the player, it's important that the bullet count and launch interval equal 360 when multiplied together. Black Flame Ritual and Radagon's Rings of Light are all really good examples of what this looks like when done correctly. Finally, damage fall off should be another self-explanatory parameter, but it's controlled by a percent, so you should never set it to anything above 100 if you don't want things to start acting weird. Elevation angle controls the vertical angle at which the bullet fires, and the lock direction angle controls the angle at which you can aim it vertically. Very similar, but not exactly the same. You should only ever use the elevation angle if you want a bullet to travel in a very specific angle, while the lock direction is more commonly used for aiming flexibility on simple spells like Glintstone Pebble or Lightning Spear. The attribute parameters aren't really too hard to figure out. If you're in Map Studio, you can right-click on the red text and it'll give you a list of what you can select. Attack attribute lets you decide the type of physical damage, and the one below it lets you select either an elemental type or a status type. Penetration parameters sounds like something a comp sci nerd would say in a 90s movie when referring to something about sex, but it's actually just a means of whether or not a bullet travels through something while also hitting it. If you want it to pierce characters, I can't imagine why you wouldn't also want it to pierce objects as well. I can't think of a single spell that doesn't have both or neither of these enabled at once. Penetrate map is also useful for a bullet with a really large blast radius, but there are specific applications we can always get into later. Follow and emitter parameters have multiple types to them, and depending on the type of spell you're looking to make, you'll probably use a couple of them more than you will the others. Adjusting the follow parameter to a value of 1 through 6 will allow the bullet you launch to follow your character in different ways. The emitter value, which is also set 1 through 6, can be used used to control how the bullets travel. We'll get to emitters here in a second, but this is going to be important later. Persistence effects mean the bullets you fire will be lodged in the target for an amount of time, which is usually only a function reserved for physical arrows instead of spells. The continuous hit parameter is commonly used for status building abilities such as Death Lightning, which allows the continual buildup of Death Blight so long as something is in the radius of the bullet. Hit both teams parameter hits both teams. Any effects the bullet has applied to it will affect you as well, which is seen on spells like Night Maiden's Mist. A shared hit list is seen on abilities that have multiple bullets but only seem to damage the target 3 or 4 times, such as Beast Claw and Flame Fall upon them. Shared hit lists can be used intentionally to bottleneck the damage of multi-hit spells and abilities, preventing them from getting too outrageous towards the late game once those flat defenses stop meaning anything. There are a couple more parameters that control whether a bullet can be deflected by magic, which is almost always useless when you're adjusting player abilities because this will only be affected by multiplayer 90% of the time, but you can also change this value on enemy bullets so you can deflect them with spells like Thops' Barrier or Wrath of Gold, just in case you want to make the game easier for yourself. Or if you want to look cool by deflecting fire from a dragon. Alright, this shit's boring, let's talk about emitters. Hit bullet IDs are used to control what bullet comes after it when it expires. Bullet emitters, on the other hand, let you specify a second bullet ID that can be launched when the first bullet is active. You're probably going to crash your game a couple times messing with these parameters because this can get visually heavy really fucking quickly if you aren't careful, so just be careful, I guess. The bullet emitter section consists of 3 main parameters. There's the ID of the bullet emitter itself, and the minimum and maximum times that the bullet emitter can be triggered. This affects the overall randomness of the emitter, and is commonly used in character abilities that have a lot going on visually. Bullet emitters are used on plenty of different spells and skills and all types of character abilities. Lightning Strike, Explosive Ghost Flame, Briars of Punishment, Horaloo's Earthshaker, anything that has more than a couple visual effects at a time probably uses a bullet emitter. So let's start out by breaking down Lightning Strike. Lightning Strike is a sequence of hit bullets that each have their own emitter. I've given all the invisible bullets a Glintstone Pebble ID so we can see the bullet movement itself and actually look at what's going on here. The very first bullet launches upwards at an almost but not quite 90-degree angle and then stops. The second bullet is a simple forward traveling bullet that has a life of 0.12 seconds. The third bullet in the sequence has a shorter life of 0.08 seconds, but also has a launch angle of 50 and a launch interval of 30, offsetting its travel just to the right. The fourth in the sequence shares the same velocity but with a lifespan of 0.14 seconds and has a launch angle of -100, which sharply turns it back to the other direction. Then the fifth bullet with another positive launch angle that turns it back to the right, and finally the sixth with another negative. Now here's where the emitters come into play. Each bullet, excluding the first, has a bullet emitter ID that controls where the lightning strikes in the spell are located. This is dropped from the bullets in the main sequence at a rate of 20 per second. Both the gravity and velocity are set to 999, so each one of those fuckers are pretty much being spiked straight into the floor. This bullet hitting the ground sets off a secondary bullet sequence beginning from 009 to 012, starting with a yellow static visual effect that predetermines where the actual damage is going to land, then the lightning bolt, then an invisible bullet with the same attack ID of the previous bullet with a vertical launch angle of 89, sending the damage upward to take care of any flying enemies that may be present. There are 4 more bullets in this sequence apparently, but they never get used. Even if I use a bullet longer, the bullet sequence stops at 13, so I haven't the faintest idea what the remaining bullets in the sequence are even doing here. A lot of the lightning incantations that surround the player, like Death Lightning or Ancient Lightning Strike, go by the same principles. Only the very first bullet of the sequence has a multiple bullet count and the appropriate launch interval. Here's what Lightning Strike looks like if I set the bullet count to 5 with an angle interval of 72. And this is what it looks like with a bullet count of 9 and an angle interval of 40. The two parameters above the emitter ID allow you to control the randomness of the launch and elevation angles, or basically the X and Y axes. Bestial Sling uses this function by firing a fan of 11 bullets and adjusting the randomness of the X-axis so they spread out a bit more realistically. Flamefall Upon Them has a similar set of physics to it, but it actually applies a bit of randomness to both the X and Y axes. This can get a little confusing, but the basic concept is that adjusting the randomness of the X-axis will displace the bullets along their individual Y-axes like so. That confused me a little bit when I first started out, so I figured I would just throw that little bit of info in there to help a few people out. The secondary segment of this video might be a little complicated because unlike visual effects, special effects go a little deeper. They can be added to individual bullets, they can target both you and enemies or even allies, and multiple special effects can also be tied to the same single bullet. Let's take a simple talisman effect like Magic Scorpion Charm. The effects of Magic Scorpion Charm raises magic damage while lowering the player's physical defense, and despite that sounding like it should be broken up into two separate effects, it can actually be done using only one. No complicated state infos required, no effect chains, just head to the damage percent magic parameter and set it to a value slightly over 1, and then head down to the absorption percent physical parameter and set it to a value that's also slightly over 1, and that's it. You've pretty much just made Magic Scorpion Charm from the ground up. Any talisman or spell or Ash of War that's as simple as boosting or decreasing a certain amount of damage can be done in this way, and this can be done with way more than just damage. It can be used to give the player status resistances, increase elemental defense, guard stability, poise, cast speed, maximum HP, FP, or stamina, even the amount of runes you can temporarily acquire from enemies. The easiest thing to do here, which I have a feeling is what a lot of others have done and will likely do, is to just take an already established effect in SP effect param and just use that as a template. This is the safest way to add special effects, buffs, debuffs, or whatever to your bullets without overwriting anything. And honestly, it's actually more efficient than you would think too, because you're not only limited to player special effects, there is a massive library of different special effects you can browse just by looking under this section. For instance, if I were to search HP and go to the 18,000s, I would find each special effect for Melania's on-hit health restoration, where each single effect restores a different amount of HP depending on what attack she's using. All I would really have to do is take one of these effects and tie it to another bullet. Let's use Glintstone Pebble for example, turn down the damage and attack param, and there you go. You've made a fully competent support sorcery in just a few seconds. Is it flashy? No, not at all, but it gets the job done. Any established effect that you can find anywhere else in the game can be attached to any bullet in this way. You can use the special effect of Blessing's Boon and attach it to Flame Cleanse Me, and up the health regeneration enough to counteract poison and Scarlet Rot in a way that's similarly efficient to just curing it outright, allowing it extra utility on Rot Exaltation builds. This is just a couple examples of how special effect param can be used to create different restorative effects, but that barely even scratches the surface of how they can be used. Let's look at talismans. Talismans have the most diverse selection of special effects you can apply to your character by miles. They have everything from simple HP and FP restoration to a 4-stage effect chain that increases your attack power incrementally, so long as a specific quantity of player attacks have connected with an enemy. Of course, I'm talking about Millicent's Prosthesis, and yes, the effect is actually that complicated. Basically what it does is use something called an accumulator to measure how involved the player is in combat. Shown here, if the accumulator passes a certain value, it applies effect 312505 to the player, which is the first stage of the attack boost. If the player continues to be involved in combat, the accumulator is allowed to go further and further up, eventually applying effects 312506 through 508, which are respectively the second through fourth stages of the attack boost effect. This results in 9 different effects in total. The first effect, which obviously is just there to detect whether or not the talisman is equipped, and if so, increases the player's dexterity by 5. The second through fifth effects all use state info 305, which marks the effects as conditional and will only activate once a certain condition is met. Each condition being whether or not the accumulator has been raised to a certain amount, i.e. how involved the player is in combat in this specific case. Each condition, when met, activates a separate array of effects that increases the attack damage of the player by a certain amount. These are effects 6 through 9, each of which has a state info of 120, which tells it to remove the previous buff given to the player to make sure the attack buffs don't stack as they're applied, which would overpower your character to an insane degree that wouldn't even be fair or fun to play. And that's not even the most complicated effect chain in the talisman section, let alone in the whole game. Law of Regression has close to 30 individual effects, each of which is responsible for curing a separate status ailment while also making sure it's no longer able to accumulate on your character, all while reserving a special effect for erasing the buffs of any enemies around you. Law of Causality uses a specific state info called a karmic justice counter, and I still don't even know how that works. Every single status in the game has its own special effect attached to it that facilitates how much status your attack will apply, all the way from a +0 to a +25 weapon. Sometimes it's hard to tell whether or not an effect is even used. Great Stars has 2 different special effects that restore HP upon hitting an enemy with it. The top effect increases the player's HP by 1%, but the bottom effect doesn't even have anything written in this parameter, so I guess it would just be part of cut content or something, but it still shows up on the bullet logger when I equip the weapon, so I'm not even sure what it's doing here. And Jesus fucking Christ, this game is so goddamn difficult to modify sometimes. What am I doing with my life? Why do I believe in anything? I originally wanted to make this video to encourage other people to get into Elden Ring modding, not because I think it's fun or rewarding or how flexibly you can edit a single bullet or special effect. And don't get me wrong, modding is every single one of those things and a bunch of other things, but I ultimately want to recommend it because seeing how much community support this game has and how much support Souls games have had for years, it just blows my fucking mind, man. The people are unbelievably helpful with pretty much anything you ask them, even if they've already answered the same question 58 times in a Discord server, which taught me the importance of checking all the channels in said server before just blindly asking a question that's probably already been answered 10 months ago somewhere in a pin. It's one of the hardest things I've ever done, and it's also been one of the most fun experiences I've ever had with the game. Sorcery mod's coming out soon. Promise.